The city had fallen into darkness. Eliza peered out from the boarded-up window of the safe house, watching the nightmarish scene unfold below. Hordes of the infected roamed the streets, their twisted bodies shambling and snarling as they searched for prey. All around, the sounds of screams and the sickening crunching of flesh echoed through the air. Eliza clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. This was no longer the world she knew. Just days ago, she had been an ordinary woman, going about her life blissfully unaware of the chaos to come. Then the reports had started coming in, the hospitals overflowing, the death toll rising exponentially. No one knew what was causing the bizarre illness that was turning people into savage killers. But as the contagion spread, the truth became impossible to ignore. The dead were rising, and the living were being driven to the brink of extinction. Eliza had fled with a small group of survivors, holing up in this makeshift shelter, but their sanctuary was crumbling. Supplies were dwindling, and the infected were closing in. Eventually, they would have to risk the treacherous streets to search for safety. But the very thought of it filled Eliza with paralyzing dread. Each time she envisioned stepping out that door, she saw only carnage and death. A sudden crash from the kitchen jolted Eliza from her thoughts. Someone or something had breached their defenses. Heart pounding, she raced to investigate, and what she found made her blood run cold. One of her fellow survivors, a young woman named Tess, lay motionless on the floor, her body savagely mutilated. Looming over her was another member of their group, a man named Jack, his hands and clothes soaked in blood. Eliza stared at him in horror. Jack shook his head, frantically crying that it had been an accident, that the infected had somehow gotten in. But Eliza could see the manic terror in his eyes and the savage wounds on Tess' body. She knew the truth. Whatever had happened here, it was no accident. Jack's own hands had taken an innocent life. As if summoned by the commotion, more of the undead began to close in. Drawn by the sound and scent of fresh blood, Eliza could hear their snarls and the pounding of their decaying bodies against the barricaded doors. The fragile safety of their shelter was crumbling all around them, and their only hope of survival now hung by a thread. Eliza turned to Jack, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "What do we do? How do we get out of here?" Jack's eyes darted around the room. He was clearly panicked and overwhelmed. Eliza could practically see the gears turning in his mind as he fought to find a way out of this nightmare. "We need to leave," he blurted out. "We need to get to the military stronghold on the edge of the city. That's our only chance." Eliza felt a flicker of hope at his words. The stronghold was a rumored safe haven, a last bastion of civilization in this apocalyptic world, but getting there would mean braving the horrors of the streets, teeming with the infected, and who knew what other dangers. As the barricades shuddered under the weight of the undead, Eliza knew they had no choice. She glanced once more at Tess' lifeless body and steeled her resolve. If there was any hope of survival, it lay outside these walls, no matter how perilous the journey. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Moments later, the group was moving, rushing out into the nightmarish chaos of the city streets. With the infected in pursuit, their desperate flight had begun. Eliza's heart pounded as she raced through the abandoned streets, her lungs burning from the exertion. The howls and snarls of the undead echoed all around them as the horde gave chase. Beside her, Jack was gasping for breath, his face twisted with terror. The rest of their small group ran ahead of them. Eliza could see the desperation in their movements as they darted between wrecked cars and piles of debris, trying to outrun the infected close behind them. The undead surged forward, their decaying bodies lurching and stumbling, but driven by an unrelenting hunger. Eliza knew they couldn't keep this pace for long. Sooner or later their strength would fail, and the infected would catch up to them. Yet she pushed on, driven by the primal need to survive. Ahead, she caught a glimpse of their destination, the imposing walls of the military stronghold looming in the distance. If they could just make it there, they might have a chance. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air, and Eliza whirled around to see one of their group, a young woman named Lily, being dragged down by a horde of the infected. Her anguished cries echoed through the empty streets as the undead swarmed over her, tearing into her flesh. Eliza watched in horror as the life left Lily's eyes, and she went limp under the weight of her attackers. The survivors didn't slow their pace. Eliza saw the grim determination on their faces as they pressed on, leaving Lily's broken body behind. A harsh reality of this new world had set in. There was no time to mourn the dead, only a desperate need to survive. As they rounded a corner, Eliza's blood ran cold. The street ahead was completely blocked by a massive swarm of the infected. Hundreds upon hundreds of the undead crowded the narrow passage, their rotting bodies surging forward in a relentless tide. There was no way through. Eliza felt her heart sink as they were trapped between the horde behind and the one in front of them. Jack grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We're going to die out here," he cried. Eliza opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as suddenly a deafening roar filled the air. Headlights blazed to life, piercing the gloom as a convoy of military vehicles charged down the street. Their massive tires crushed the undead in their path, and the sound of gunfire echoed all around them. Eliza watched in stunned disbelief as armored soldiers leaped from the vehicle's weapons, blazing, cutting a path through the infected like a shining beacon of hope. The survivors rushed towards the military convoy, weeping with relief as they were ushered inside the armored transports. Safe at last, Eliza allowed herself a moment to catch her breath, but as the adrenaline faded, a wave of grief threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of Lily and the others. They had lost, tears welling in her eyes. She had narrowly escaped the jaws of death, but at what cost? The military vehicles rolled on towards the stronghold, and Eliza gazed out the window at the ruined city streets. The bodies of the infected scattered all around. Sorrow and fear warred within her. What kind of world was this now? And what horrors might still lie ahead? As they approached the towering walls of the stronghold, Eliza steeled herself for whatever might come next. She would have to face the commanders of this last bastion of humanity, but she was determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost, even if it meant risking everything. The military convoy rumbled to a stop at the gates of the stronghold, and Eliza held her breath as they were ushered inside. The massive walls loomed above them, a last line of defense against the horrors that now gripped the world outside. The screams and snarls of the infected echoed faintly, but within these walls, Eliza dared to hope they might find sanctuary. As the survivors disembarked, Eliza scanned the bustling activity around them. Soldiers in full combat gear patrolled the perimeter, while support staff hurried to and fro. Ministers were being unloaded from other vehicles, some injured, some weeping. The stronghold was a hive of frantic activity, but beneath the surface, Eliza sensed an undercurrent of unease. Moments later, they were ushered into a command center where a grizzled officer in fatigues waited to greet them. His expression was grim as he surveyed the ragged group of survivors. "Welcome to Fort Remus," he announced in a somber tone. "This is the last stronghold of the human army, and your best chance at survival." Eliza felt a spark of hope at his words, but it was quickly extinguished as the officer continued, his brow furrowing with a troubled frown. "However," he said, "you should know that we have been forced to make some difficult decisions in order to preserve our defenses. Not everyone who comes to our gates can be admitted." Eliza's stomach tightened with unease. What did he mean by that? Were they turning away desperate refugees, leaving them to the mercy of the infected? The officer met her gaze, his eyes hardening. "I'm afraid your group is too large to be accommodated here," he said bluntly. "We simply don't have the resources to support so many." Eliza's heart sank as the implications of his words sank in. They were going to be turned away to fend for themselves out in the wasteland, at the mercy of the undead, with no hope of survival. But one of the other survivors, a young man, stepped forward, his voice trembling with fear. "Please, sir, you have to help us. We'll do anything, just don't send us back out there." The officer held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm sorry, but my orders are clear," he said firmly. "Only those deemed essential to our operations can be admitted. The rest must be turned away." Eliza watched in horror as her companions began to plead and argue, their voices rising in desperation. But the officer's expression remained unbending. His decision was final. They would not be allowed to stay. As the survivors were herded out through the gates, Eliza felt the last ember of hope within her flicker and die. Trapped between the undead horde and this calloused regime, there was nowhere left to turn the world, as she knew it was gone, and the future had never seemed so bleak. Eliza trudged through the gates of Fort Remus, her head bowed in defeat. The commander's words still echoed in her mind, a brutal reminder that even in this last bastion of humanity, there was no sanctuary to be found. Her fellow survivors walked beside her, heads down, shoulders slumped, their final hope now extinguished. As they reached the outer perimeter, Eliza paused to survey the grim scene before her. The once bustling streets were now a wasteland broken and desolate save for the shambling hordes of the infected that roamed freely. Burnt-out vehicles and debris littered the ground, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Eliza felt a shiver of dread coil in the pit of her stomach. This was no place for the living. The infected were everywhere, prowling the shadows and alleyways, ready to pounce on any unfortunate soul who dared to venture out, but staying put was no safer. The commander's words had made that clear. They could not remain here. Jack came to stand beside her, his eyes hollow with defeat. "What do we do now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Eliza didn't have an answer. The future had never seemed so uncertain, so bleak. She had been so certain that the military stronghold would be their salvation, but now that fragile hope lay shattered at their feet. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "Eliza, you're still here." She turned to see one of the soldiers, a young woman named Anya, hurrying towards them. Anya had been part of the convoy that rescued them from the infected horde, and Eliza felt a surge of relief at the sight of a friendly face. "Anya, what's going on?" Eliza asked, her voice infused with a desperate plea for help. "Why didn't they let us stay?" Anya's expression darkened as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. "The commander's orders," she said quietly. "He's only allowing essential personnel and high-value survivors to take refuge here." Eliza felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean, high-value survivors?" she pressed. Anya hesitated, biting her lip. "I'm not supposed to discuss it, but the truth is this place is more than just a military stronghold," she confessed. "It's the headquarters of a secret organization that's been strategically abandoning certain sectors to the infected." Eliza stared at her in disbelief. "Abandoning them?" she breathed. "But why?" Anya shook her head. "I don't know all the details," she admitted, "but I do know they're trying to control the remaining population through fear and force, keeping the strong and skilled while sacrificing the weak." Eliza's mind reeled as she tried to process this shocking revelation. The military, the one beacon of hope in this devastated world, was in fact a ruthless regime intent on preserving its own power at the expense of the very people it was sworn to protect. A surge of rage filled her chest. How could they do this? She demanded. "They're supposed to be protecting us, not condemning us to die." Anya's gaze fell to the ground. "I'm sorry, Eliza," she whispered. "I wish I could help. But if the commander finds out I've said anything, I'll be labeled a traitor too." With that, Anya turned and hurried back through the gates, leaving Eliza and the others to face their uncertain fate. Faced with the cruelty of this new world, Eliza felt her heart harden. She would not accept this. She refused to be a pawn in their twisted game. No matter what it took, she would expose their treachery and bring them down. Eliza's mind raced as she processed Anya's shocking revelations. The military, the last bastion of hope in this apocalyptic world, was in fact a calloused regime intent on preserving its own power through fear and control. Rather than protecting the innocent, they were sacrificing the weak and vulnerable to maintain their grip on the remaining population. Filled with a surge of rage, Eliza knew she had to act quickly before the gates of Fort Remus closed for good. She gathered the other survivors, determined to uncover the truth and bring down the commander's regime. "We can't just accept this," she declared, her voice trembling with emotion. "These soldiers, they're not heroes, they're traitors, and we need to expose them." The others stared at her in a mixture of disbelief and fear, but Eliza pressed on undaunted. "We need to get inside that fortress and find a way to bring down their operation from the inside." One of the men, a weathered older survivor, scoffed. "And what do you think that's going to accomplish?" He retorted. "They've already made it clear they won't let us in. We're as good as dead out here." Eliza met his gaze unwavering. "I'd rather die fighting than be left to the mercy of the infected or these twisted bastards," she growled. The man shook his head in resignation. "Fine," he muttered. "If you want to get yourself killed, be my guest, but count me out." But the others began to murmur in agreement, their eyes alight with a newfound determination. Eliza saw the spark of rebellion ignite within them. If there was even the slightest chance of survival, they were willing to take the risk. Quickly, Eliza laid out her plan. They would need to find a way to infiltrate the stronghold undetected. Once inside, they would seek out any evidence of the commander's treachery and use it to turn the soldiers against their own leaders. It was a risky gambit, but with the infected hordes at their heels, and the military turning them away, they had little choice. As the group set out to execute Eliza's plan, she felt a grim resolve settle over her. If they failed, they would perish, but if they succeeded, they might just expose the truth and bring down the corrupt regime from within. The journey to the fortress gates was harrowing, dodging the shambling undead, and wary of any roaming patrols. The survivors crept through the ruined streets, finally reaching the towering walls of Fort Remus. But just as they were about to make their move, Eliza was suddenly seized from behind. She struggled against her captor, only to find herself face to face with the commander himself, his eyes cold and cruel. "So," he sneered, "you thought you could infiltrate my fortress and undermine my authority." Eliza glared at him defiantly, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're a monster," she spat. "You've doomed us all." The commander laughed mirthlessly. Perhaps he purred. "But I've ensured the survival of the strongest, the most valuable to our cause." He gestured to the soldiers who had surrounded the other survivors. "You, on the other hand, are a liability." Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the commander turned to his men. "Take her away," he ordered. "She's to be executed at dawn." Eliza's heart pounded as she was dragged before the commander, her wrists bound tightly behind her back. So this was how it ended. After all, she had endured the horrors of the undead, the loss of her friends, and now the bitter betrayal of the very institution she had pinned her hopes on. The commander regarded her with cold indifference as the soldiers forced her to her knees. "You've proven to be a most persistent thorn in my side," he sneered, "but your little rebellion ends here." Eliza met his gaze defiantly, her voice laced with contempt. "You're a monster," she spat. "How many innocent lives have you sacrificed to preserve your own power?" The commander chuckled mirthlessly. "Necessary sacrifices," he replied dismissively. "I'm protecting the future of humanity, not wasting resources on the weak and useless." Eliza felt bile rise in her throat at his callous words. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You're abandoning people to die out there." The commander waved a hand in a careless gesture. "That's hardly my concern," he said coolly. "The strong will survive, the weak will perish. It's the natural order of things." Eliza struggled against her bonds, her mind racing desperately for a way out of this nightmare, but the commander simply shook his head. "Take her to the execution yard," he ordered, his voice impassive. "She's to be made an example of." As the soldiers began to drag her away, Eliza's eyes darted around the courtyard, searching for any sign of hope. But all she saw were hardened faces and the glint of steel as the soldiers raised their rifles. She was out of time, out of options. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the crowd, a face Eliza recognized with a sickening jolt. It was Jack, the man who had betrayed them back at the safe house, his eyes now filled with a twisted hunger. Eliza stared at him in disbelief. How could he have fallen in with these monsters after all they had been through together? They had narrowly escaped the undead horde, only for him to turn his back on her. Jack met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and for a moment Eliza dared to hope that perhaps he still held some shred of humanity. But then he opened his mouth and spoke the words that shattered what little hope she had left. "The commander has granted me a pardon," the traitor announced, his voice thick with triumph. "All I had to do was eliminate the threat." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face as the soldiers raised their rifles. She shut her eyes, bracing for the end. But the crack of gunfire never came. Instead, the sound of the soldiers' startled cries filled the air. Eliza's eyes snapped open to see Jack standing before her, a firearm in his hand. The soldiers sprawled at his feet. Stunned, Eliza stared at him as he swiftly cut the ropes binding her wrists. "We need to move," he said urgently, his gaze darting around the courtyard, quickly before they realize what's happened. Eliza hesitated, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. Why, she began haltingly, "why are you helping me?" Jack's expression hardened. "I may have betrayed you once," he said, "but I'll be damned if I let them execute you." For a moment, Eliza was speechless. Then, without another word, she followed him as he led her away from the execution yard and out into the dark maze of the fortress's inner sanctum. Eliza's heart pounded as she raced through the shadowy corridors of Fort Remus, her mind still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. Just moments ago, she had been facing a firing squad, her fate sealed by the commander's cruel decree. But now, thanks to the sudden intervention of the very man who had once betrayed her, she found herself fleeing into the unknown. Beside her, Jack moved with a sense of purpose, his expression grim as he navigated the winding maze of the fortress. Eliza followed closely on his heels, wary of his intentions, but desperate to put as much distance between herself and the commander's men as possible. "Where are we going?" She panted, her lungs burning from the exertion. Jack glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowed. "We need to get out of this place," he growled, "before they realize what I've done." Eliza studied him carefully, a flicker of suspicion stirring within her. "You betrayed us before. How do I know you're not leading me into another trap?" Jack's jaw tightened. "I deserve your mistrust," he admitted, "but right now I'm the only chance you've got of getting out of here alive." Eliza held his gaze, searching for any sign of deception, but saw only a glimmer of resolve in his eyes. Reluctantly, she nodded and pressed, unwilling to take the risk if it meant escaping this nightmare. As they moved deeper into the fortress, Eliza couldn't help but marvel at the scale of the place. It was a sprawling labyrinth of armories, barracks, and command centers, all meticulously maintained by a small army of soldiers and support staff. The sheer power and resources at the commander's disposal was staggering. Yet beneath the veneer of military efficiency, Eliza detected an undercurrent of unease. The soldiers they passed moved with a sense of urgency, their expressions tense and wary, as if they too were haunted by the dark realities of this place. Suddenly, a shrill alarm pierced the air, startling Eliza. Jack cursed under his breath, quickening his pace. Eliza's heart raced as she realized they must have been discovered. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the commander's men in hot pursuit. "Jack, we have to get out of here," she urged, her voice tinged with panic. "I'm working on it," he snapped grimly. "There has to be an exit somewhere in this damned place." They rounded a corner, and Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Ahead of them, a massive horde of the infected surged forward, their snarls echoing through the corridors. Jack skidded to a halt, his eyes widening in horror. Trapped between the soldiers and the undead, Eliza felt a surge of panic. "Oh God," she breathed, "what do we do?" Jack's gaze darted around, wildly searching for a way out, but Eliza could see the desperation in his eyes. They were surrounded, with no means of escape. Eliza braced herself for the end, when suddenly a door burst open, and a hand shot out, yanking her inside. She stumbled into the dimly lit room, heart pounding, as Jack followed close behind, slamming the door behind them. Gasping for breath, Eliza whirled around and found herself staring into the wild-eyed face of the very man who had betrayed her back at the safe house. Jack's eyes were wide with terror as he pressed his ear to the door, straining to listen for any sign of pursuit. Eliza opened her mouth to confront him, but a low growl from the shadows made her blood run cold. Whirling around, she found herself face to face with a swarm of the infected, their pale eyes gleaming with unholy hunger. Eliza's stomach turned as she realized they had fled one danger only to stumble into another. She and Jack were trapped not just by the soldiers, but by the very horrors they had been trying to escape. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the snarling horde of infected, her mind racing to find a way out of this nightmare. She glanced over her shoulder at Jack, his eyes wild with fear. As much as she loathed the idea of relying on his aid, she knew they were both trapped, caught between the hammer of the undead and the anvil of the military's treachery. Summoning her courage, Eliza turned to Jack, her voice trembling slightly. "What do we do?" Jack shook his head frantically, his gaze darting around the dimly lit room. "I don't know," he whispered. "We're surrounded on all sides." Eliza gritted her teeth, forcing down the rising panic. The commander's men would be scouring the fortress for them, and the infected were closing in rapidly. They had to find a way out, and fast. Thinking quickly, she scanned the room, her eyes finally settling on a heavy iron door on the far wall. "It must lead deeper into the complex," she reasoned. "If we can get through there, we might just have a chance." Jack followed her gaze, his brow furrowing uncertainly. "That's the inner sanctum," he murmured, "the commander's personal chambers. It'll be heavily guarded." Eliza met his gaze unflinching. "Then we'll have to be careful," she replied, "but it's our only shot." For a moment, Jack hesitated, clearly conflicted, but as the infected surged forward, he knew they had no choice. Bracing himself, he nodded grimly. "Let's go." Steeling themselves, the pair rushed towards the door. Eliza's fingers fumbled with the heavy latch as the undead drew ever closer. Beside her, Jack stood guard, his weapon drawn ready to cut down any that dared to approach. At last the latch gave way, and they tumbled through the doorway, slamming it shut behind them. Eliza's heart pounded in her ears as they paused to catch their breath, but they didn't have time to rest. "We need to keep moving," she said urgently. "Jack, who knows what's waiting for us in there?" He nodded wordlessly, and they pressed on, winding their way through the shadowy corridors of the inner sanctum. Eliza couldn't shake the nagging sense of dread that something far worse than the infected was lurking in the darkness ahead. As they went, Eliza's mind raced with 1,000 questions. What twisted agenda had driven the commander to betray his own people? What unspeakable horrors lay at the heart of this fortress? And was there any hope of exposing the truth before they too fell victim to the commander's machinations? She glanced over at Jack, the man who had once betrayed her, and now seemed to be her only ally in this nightmarish world. Somehow, in the face of such overwhelming adversity, their roles had reversed, and Eliza found herself placing her trust in his hands. But could she truly depend on him? Or was he simply biding his time, waiting to strike the final blow? The shifting loyalties of this new world had left her uncertain of anything save her own determination to survive. Pushing forward, Eliza knew she had to uncover the commander's darkest secrets if she ever hoped to escape this living hell, even if it meant venturing deeper into the heart of darkness, where untold horrors awaited.